Luke also appeals in Luke 1:4 to what was already common knowledge in the church. He says to Theophilus, to whom he dedicates the work, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. No, if I say to you, do you remember last week when you and I sat down and ate carrots together? Unless you're my wife and my kids, you'll probably say to me, I did not eat carrots with you last week. I can't really get away with convincing you that you know something that you don't. At least I can't do that very easily. Luke is not going to say to Theophilus, I'm confirming the things you already know, if the contents of his book are not things that were already known to Theophilus. At least the basic stories that are there in Luke Acts are things that Theophilus had already heard about. This was already common knowledge in the church within these 4.5 decades or so of the early church. It's the same when Paul cites his audience's knowledge that he did miracles in 2 Corinthians 12:12. He cites that to the Corinthians. He says, you saw that. So it's not something that he could possibly be making up. Other evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. Later debates central to the church are missing. 2.5 decades, even 2 decades after Jesus' resurrection, one of the major debates in the church was, do Gentiles have to be circumcised to be full members of the community of believers in Jesus? Well, if the early Christians were making things up, you'd think that some would have made up sayings, yes, you have to be circumcised, and others would have made up sayings, no, you don't have to be circumcised. We have no sayings on that in the Gospels, which suggests to us that the church wasn't making things up. They were passing on accurately what they had from Jesus. In the same way, Paul, the earliest New Testament writer, sometimes attests what we have in the Synoptic Gospels. The resurrection tradition and witnesses he cites, he says that what I have about the Lord's Supper, I received from the Lord, I passed it on to you. It's just very much like what we have in Mark chapter 14 about the Lord's Supper. Well, some people have said, well, he received it from the Lord. It must have been in a vision or something. Well, it could mean that. But again, it was a common technique for ancient Jewish teachers to say, we received this from Moses on Mount Sinai. They didn't mean they received it directly from him, but that they received it by oral tradition, which they believed went back to Moses on Mount Sinai. In the case of Paul, he could have received some of these things from some of the other disciples. And again, this is within the generation that this happened. These are disciples who were with Jesus. And he passes it on as oral tradition. The divorce saying in 1 Corinthians 7, which I'll come back to in a moment, Jesus' end-time teachings reflect what we have. In Paul, it echoes very closely what we have in Jesus' teachings, in contrast to some other sources that we have from antiquity, possibly also some of Jesus' ethics. Now, with the divorce saying, Paul has a perfect opportunity here to make up a saying for Jesus if he wanted to. But instead, he distinguishes what Jesus said from what he himself says. Jesus made a general statement saying, okay, no divorce. Don't divorce your spouse. And Paul has to qualify it for a particular situation. He says, Jesus said this, just like Jesus says, you've heard it said, and he quotes the law, and then says, I say to you. Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 said, this is what the Lord says. Chapter 7, verses 10 through 12. Then he says, now, this is what I say, not contradicting Jesus, but qualifying what Jesus said for a particular situation that Jesus didn't address. He specifically distinguishes Jesus' authoritative teaching from his own teaching, which is also inspired, but it's not what Jesus said. In the same way, if writers were freely inventing stories, we wouldn't have the kind of overlap that we have in the Synoptic Gospels, or the various parallels that we have in John, even though John mostly emphasizes different things. And this has been noted by E.P. Sanders, whom I like to cite, partly because I studied with him at Duke. I was his TA for a while. But also, it's just commonly noted.